Hello, and welcome to our 40th Tuesday Tales of Terror, which means that I have now been doing this officially for 10 weeks. 10 weeks. 40 weeks, 10 months. It's the longest I've done anything in a long time. Very, very pleased. So, fun story. If you were here last week, welcome back. Then you remember that Neil Gaiman reintroduced a Scottish character. And initially, I was really hesitant because I'm not that great with Scottish accents. If you follow me on YouTube, if you don't subscribe to me on YouTube, I don't understand what you're doing. I mean, it's the best way to look at the videos. Please subscribe. But I do have a subscriber who found me completely randomly. And this person is really wonderful. They comment every single week on my videos. They like my videos every week. And it turns out, you know who you are. I want to send you a big shout out. Thank you. Turns out that they are Scottish. And they got a kick out of me attempting the Scottish accent. And so they said very kindly that to do a good Scottish accent, I need to be aggressive but not hateful and roll my R's, which I've learned is not really like a roll. It's called a tap because you're just tapping the top of your mouth when you say your R's. So we're going to do our best. I'm going to butcher it. I hope that you have your blood-proof clothing on because it's going to be a murder. We're butchering it. Let's go. Okay, so Scarlett got lost. Remember, she took the wrong bus. She ended up on the wrong side of the town. And then there was this like strange man. It was raining. It was really awful. There was this man who offered her a ride. And then he just recently, just brought her back. And he said, please forgive her for being late and don't yell at her. And that's where we are. So let's begin. Drink some water. Rules are rules. Scarlett expected her mother to shout at both of them, and was surprised and relieved when her mother only said, "Well, you couldn't be too careful these days. And was Mr. a teacher? And would you like a cup of tea?" Mr. Said his name was Frost, but she should call him Jay, and Mrs. Perkins smiled. He should call her Nuna, and she'd put the kettle on. Over tea, Scarlett told her mother the story of her wrong bus adventure, and how she had found herself at the graveyard, and how she met Mr. Frost by the little church. Mrs. Perkins dropped her teacup. They were sitting around the table in the kitchen, so the cup didn't fall very far, and it didn't break, just spilled tea. Mrs. Perkins apologized awkwardly and went and got a cloth from the sink to mop it up. Then she said, "The graveyard on the hill, in the old town, that one."
I live over that way," said Mr. Frost. "Been doing a lot of grave rubbings, and it's technically a nature reserve."
Mrs. Perkins said, "I know," thin-lipped. Then she said, "Thank you so much for giving Scarlett a ride home, Mr. Frost." Each word might have been an ice cube. Then, "I think you should leave now."
"Oh, I say that's a bit much," said Frost amiably. "Didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Was it something I said? The rubbings, they're for a local history project. It's not as if I'm, digging up bones or anything."
For a heartbeat, Scarlett thought that her mother was going to strike Mr. Frost, who just looked worried. But Mrs. Perkins shook her head and said, "Sorry, family history. Not your fault." As if she was making a conscious effort, she said brightly, "Scarlett actually used to play in the graveyard when she was little. This is 10 years ago. She had an imaginary friend too, a little boy called Nobody." A smile twitched at the corner of Mr. Frost's lips.
"A ghostie?"
"No, I don't think so. He just lived there. She even pointed out the tomb he lived in. So I suppose he was a ghost. Do you remember, love?" Scarlett shook her head. "I must have been a funny kid," she said.
"I'm sure that you are nothing of the, said Mr. Frost. "You're raising a fine girl here, Nuna. Well, lovely cup of tea. Always a joy to make new friends. I'll be toddling off now. Got to make myself a little dinner. Then I've got to meeting of the local history society.
You're making your own dinner, said Mrs. Perkins.
Is making it. Well, defrosting it, really. I'm also a master of the boil in the bag. Eating for one. Living on my own. Bit of a crusty old bachelor. Actually, in the papers, that always means gay, doesn't it? Not gay, just never met the right woman.
And for a moment he looked rather sad. Mrs. Perkins, who hated to cook, announced that she always cooked too much food at the weekend, and as she ushered Mr. Frost out into the hall, Scarlet heard him agree that he would love to come around for dinner on Saturday night. When Mrs. Perkins came back from the front hall, all she said to Scarlet was,
I hope you've done your homework.
Scarlet was thinking about the afternoon's events as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of the cars grinding their way along the main road. She had been in that graveyard when she was little. That was why everything seemed so familiar. In her mind she imagined and she remembered, and somewhere in there she fell asleep. But in sleep she still walked the paths of the graveyard. It was night, but she could see everything as clearly as if it were day. She was on the side of a hill. There was a boy about her own age, standing with his back to her, looking at the lights of the city. Scarlet said, Boy, what are you doing? He looked around, seemed to have trouble focusing. Who said that? And then, Oh, I can see you. Sort of. Are you dreamwalking? I think I'm dreaming, she agreed. Not quite what I meant, said the boy. Hello, I'm Bod. I'm Scarlet, she said. He looked at her again as if he were seeing her for the first time. Oh, of course you are. I knew you looked familiar. You were in the graveyard today with that man, the one with the paper. Mr. Frost, she said. He's really nice. He gave me a lift home. Then she said, Did you see us? Yeah. I keep an eye on most things that happen in the graveyard. What kind of name is Bod? She asked. Well, it's short for nobody. Of course, said Scarlet. That's what this dream is about. You're my imaginary friend, from when I was little, all grown up. He nodded. He was taller than she was. He wore gray, although she could not have described his clothes. His hair was too long, and she thought it had been some time since he had received a haircut. He said, You were really brave. We went deep into the hill, and we saw the Indigo Man, and we met the Sleer. Something happened then in her head, a rushing and a tumbling, a whirl of darkness and a crash of images. I remember, said Scarlet, but she said it to the empty darkness of her bedroom and heard nothing in reply but the low trundle of a distant lorry, which is a truck, making its way through the night. Bod had stores of food, the kind that lasted, cached in the crypt, and more in some of the chillier tombs and vaults and mausoleums. Silas had made sure of that. He had enough food to keep him going for a couple of months. Unless Silas or Miss Lupescu was there, he simply would not leave the graveyard. He missed the world beyond the graveyard gates, but he knew it was not safe out there. Not yet. The graveyard, though, was his world and his domain, and he was proud of it, and loved it as only a 14-year-old boy can love anything. And yet, in the graveyard, no one ever changed. The little children Bod had played with when he was small were still little children. Fortinbras Bartleby, who had once been his best friend, was now 4 or 5 years younger than Bod was, and they had less to talk about each time they saw each other. Thackeray Porringer was Bod's height and age, and seemed to be in much better temper with him. He would walk with Bod in the evenings and tell stories of unfortunate things that had happened to his friends. Normally the stories would end in the friends being hanged until they were dead for no offense of theirs, and by mistake, although sometimes they were simply transported to the American colonies, and they didn't have to be hanged unless they came back. Liza Hemstock, who had been Bod's friend for the last 6 years, was different in another way. She was less likely to be there for him when Bod went down to the nettle patch to see her, and on the rare occasions when she was, she would be short-tempered, argumentative, and often downright rude. Bod talked to Mr. Owens about this, and after a few moments' reflection, his father said, It's just women, I reckon. She liked you as a boy. Probably isn't sure you are now. You're a young man. I used to play with one little girl down by the duck pond every day, until she turned about your age, and then she threw an apple at my head. And didn't say another word to me until I was 17. Mrs. Owens sniffed.
It was a pear I threw, she said tartly. And I was talking to you again soon enough, for we danced a measure at your cousin Ned's wedding, and that was but 2 days after your 16th birthday.
Mr. Owen said,
Of course. You're right, my dear.
he winked at Bod to tell him that none of it was serious, and then he mouthed 17 to show that really it was. Bod had allowed himself no friends among the living. That way, he had realized back during his short-lived school days, lay only trouble. Still, he had remembered Scarlet, had missed her for years after she went away, had long ago faced the fact that he would never see her again, and now she had been here in his graveyard, and he had not known her. He was wandering deeper into the tangle of ivies and trees that made the graveyard's northwest quadrant so dangerous. Signs advised visitors to keep out, but the signs were not needed. It was uninviting and creepy once you were past the ivy tangle that marked the end of the Egyptian walk and the black doors and the mock Egyptian walls that led to people's final resting places. In the northwest, nature had been reclaiming the graveyard for almost 100 years, and the stones were tipped over, graves were forgotten or simply lost beneath the green ivy and the leaf fall of 50 years. Paths were lost and impassable. Bod walked with care. He knew the area well, and he knew how dangerous it could be. Who is licking? Do you mind? Thank you. When Bod was 9, he had been exploring in just this part of the world when the soil had given away beneath him, tumbling him into a hole almost 20 feet down. My roommate Jen and I were just talking about the terrors of sinkholes and how scary they are. The grave had been dug deep to accommodate many coffins, but there were no headstones and only one coffin down at the bottom, containing a rather excitable medical gentleman named Carstairs, who seemed thrilled by Bod's arrival and insisted on examining Bod's wrist, which Bod had twisted in the tumble, grabbing onto a root, before he could be persuaded to go and fetch help. Bod was making his way through the northwest quadrant, a sledge of fallen leaves, a tangle of ivy where the foxes made their homes and fallen angels stared up blindly, because he had an urge to talk to the poet. Nehemiah Trott was the poet's name, and his gravestone beneath the greenery read, "Here lies the mortal remains of Nehemiah Trott, poet, 1741 to 1774. Swans sing before they die." Oh, he was only 33 years old. Ugh. Bod said, "Master Trott, might I ask you for advice?" Nehemiah Trott beamed wanly.
Of course, brave boy. The advice of poets is the cordiality of kings. How may I smear unction on your... No, not unction. How may I give balm to your pain?
I'm not actually in pain. There's a girl I used to know, and I wasn't sure if I should find her and talk to her, or if I should just forget about it. Nehemiah Trott drew himself up to his full height, which was less than Bod's, raised both his hands to his chest excitedly, and said,
"Oh, you must go to her and implore her. You must call her your Terpsichore, your Echo, your Clytemnestra. You must write poems for her, mighty odes. I shall help you write them, and thus, and only thus, shall you win your true love's heart."
"I don't actually need to win her heart. She's not my true love," said Bod. "Just someone that I'd like to talk to."
"Of all the organs," said Nehemiah Trott, "the tongue is the most remarkable, for we use it both to taste our sweet wine and bitter poison. Thus also do we utter both words sweet and sour with the same tongue. Go to her. Talk to her."
"I shouldn't."
"You should, sir. You must. I shall write about it when the battle's lost and won."
"But if I unfade for one person, it makes it easier for other people to see me." Nehemiah Trott said,
"Ah, list to me, young lander, young hero, young Alexander. If you dare nothing, then when the day is over, nothing is all you will have gained."
Good point. Bod was pleased with himself, and glad he had thought of asking the poet for advice. Really, he thought,
If you couldn't trust a poet to offer sensible advice, who could you trust?
Which reminded him.
Mr. Trot, said Bod, tell me about revenge. Dish best served cold, said Nehemiah Trot. Do not take revenge in the heat of the moment. Instead, wait until the hour is propitious. There was a Grub Street hack named O'Leary, an Irishman, I should add, who had the nerve, the confounded cheek, to write of my first slim volume of poems, a nosegay of beauty assembled for gentlemen of quality, that it was inferior doggerel of no worth whatsoever, and that the paper it was written on would have been better used as— no, I cannot say. Let us simply agree that it was a most vulgar statement.
But you got your revenge on him? Asked Bod, curious.
On him and on his entire pestilent breed. Oh, I had my revenge, Master Owens. And it was a terrible one. I wrote and had published a letter, which I nailed to the doors of the public houses in London, where such low scribbling folk were wont to frequent, and I explained that, given the fragility of the genius poetical, I would henceforth write not for them, but only for myself and posterity, and that I should, as long as I lived, publish no more poems for them. Thus I left instructions that upon my death my poems were to be buried with me unpublished, and that only when posterity realized my genius, realized that hundreds of my verses had been lost, only then was my coffin to be disinterred, only then could my poems be removed from my cold dead hands, to finally be published to the approbation and delight of all. It is a terrible thing to be ahead of your time.
And after you died, they dug you up? And they printed the poems?
Oh, not yet, no. But there's still plenty of time. Posterity is vast.
So, that was your revenge?
Indeed, and a mightily powerful and cunning one at that.
Yes, said Bod, unconvinced.
Best served cold, said Nehemiah Trot proudly.
Bod left the northwest of the graveyard, returned through the Egyptian walk to the more orderly paths and untangled ways, and as the dusk fell, he wandered back towards the old chapel, not because he hoped Silas had returned from his travels, but because he had spent his life visiting the chapel at dusk, and it felt good to have a rhythm. And anyway, he was hungry. Bod slipped through the crypt door, down into the crypt. He moved a cardboard box filled with curled and damp parish papers and took out a carton of orange juice, an apple, a box of breadsticks, and a block of cheese, and he ate while pondering how and whether he would seek out Scarlet. He would dream walk, perhaps, since that was how she had come to him. He headed outside, was on his way to sit on the gray wooden bench, when he saw something, and he hesitated. There was someone already there, sitting on his bench. She was reading a magazine. Bod faded even more, became a part of the graveyard, no more important than a shadow or a twig. But she looked up. She looked straight at him, and she said, "Bod, is that you?" He said nothing. Then he said, "Why can you see me?"
I almost couldn't. At first, I thought you were a shadow or something. But you look like you did in my dream. You sort of came into focus.
He said nothing. Then he said, "Oh, we already read that." Next. He walked over to the bench. He said, "Can you actually read that? Isn't it too dark for you?" Scarlet closed the magazine. She said,
It's odd. You'd think it'd be too dark, but I could read it fine, no problem.
"Are you..." He trailed off, uncertain of what he had wanted to ask her. "Are you here on your own?" She nodded.
I helped Mr. Frost do some grave rubbings after school. And then I told him I wanted to sit and think here for a bit. And when I'm done here, I promised to go and have a cup of tea with him, and he'll run me home. He didn't even ask why, just said he loves sitting in graveyards too.
And and that he thinks they can be the most peaceful places in the world. Then she said, "Can I hug you?" "Do you want to?" said Bod. "Yes." "Well then," he thought for a moment, "I don't mind if you do. My hands won't go through you or anything. You're really there." "You won't go through me," he told her, and she threw her arms around him and squeezed him so tightly he could hardly breathe. He said, "That hurts." Scarlet let go. "Sorry." "No, it was nice, I mean. You just squeezed more than I was expecting." "I just wanted to know if you were real. All these years I thought you were just something in my head, and then I sort of forgot about you. But I didn't make you up, and you're back, and you're in my head, and you're in the world too." Bod smiled. He said, "You used to wear a sort of a coat. It was orange, and when I saw that particular color orange, I'd think of you. I don't suppose you still have the coat." "No," she said, "not for a long time. It'd be a wee bit too small for me now." "Yes," said Bod, "of course." "I should go home," said Scarlet. "I thought I could come up on the weekend, though." And then, seeing the expression on Bod's face, she said, "Today's Wednesday." Of course, because how would he know the days? "I'd like that." She turned to go. Then she said, "How will I find you next time?" Bod said, "I'll find you. Don't worry. Just be on your own, and I'll find you." She nodded and was gone. Bod walked back into the graveyard and up the hill until he reached the Frobisher mausoleum. He did not enter it. He climbed up the side of the building using the thick ivy root as a foothold, and he pulled himself up onto the stone roof where he sat and thought, looking out at the world of moving things beyond the graveyard. And he remembered the way that Scarlet had held him, and how safe he had felt, if only for a moment, and how fine it would be to walk safely in the lands beyond the graveyard, how good it was to be master of his own small world. Scarlet said that she didn't want a cup of tea, thank you, or a chocolate biscuit. Mr. Frost was concerned.
"Honestly," he told her, "you look like you've seen a ghost. Well, a graveyard. Not a bad place to see one if you were going to. I had an aunt once who claimed her parrot was haunted." She was a scarlet macaw, the parrot. The aunt was an architect. Never knew the details.
"I'm fine," said Scarlet. "It was just a long day."
"I'll give you a lift home, then. Any idea what this says? Been puzzling over it for half an hour now."
He indicated a grave rubbing on the little table held flat by a jam jar in each corner.
"Is that named Gladstone, do you think? Could be a relative of the Prime Minister, but I can't make out anything else."
"Oh, afraid not," said Scarlet. "But I'll take another look when I come out on Saturday."
"Is your mother likely to put in an appearance?"
"She said she'd drop me off here in the morning. Then she has to go and get groceries for dinner. She's cooking a roast chicken."
"Do you think," asked Mr. Frost hopefully, "there are likely to be roast potatoes?"
"I expect so, yes." Mr. Frost looked delighted. Then he said,
"I wouldn't want to put her out of the way, I mean."
"She's loving it," said Scarlet truthfully. "Thank you for giving me a lift home."
"More than welcome,"
said Mr. Frost. They walked together down the steps in Mr. Frost's high, narrow house to the little entrance hall at the bottom of the stairs. In Krakow, on Wawel Hill, there are caves called the Dragon's Den, named after a long-dead dragon. These are the caves that the tourists know about. There are caves beneath those caves that the tourists do not know and do not ever get to visit. They go down a long way, and they are inhabited. Silas went first, followed by the gray hugeness of Miss Lupescu, padding quietly on 4 feet just behind him. Behind them was Kandar, a bandage-wrapped Assyrian mummy with powerful eagle wings and eyes like rubies, who was carrying a small pig. There had originally been 4 of them, but they had lost Haroun in a cave far above when the Ifrit, as naturally overconfident as are all of its race, had stepped into a space bounded by 3 polished bronze mirrors and had been swallowed up in a blaze of bronze light. In moments, the Ifrit could only be seen in the mirrors and no longer in reality. In the mirrors, his fiery eyes were wide open, and his mouth was moving as if he was shouting at them to leave and beware, and then he faded and was lost to them. Silas, who had no problems with mirrors, had covered one of them with his coat, rendering the trap useless.
So, said Silas, now there are 3 of us.
And a pig, said Kandar. Pourquoi? Asked Miss Lupescu, because remember, I said she's French. I don't care if she's supposed to be Russian or whatever. With a wolf tongue through wolf teeth. Why, the pig?
It's lucky,
said Kandar. Miss Lupescu growled, unconvinced.
Did Haruan have a pig?
Asked Kandar simply.
Hush, said Silas. They're coming. From the sound of it, many of them.
Let them come, whispered Kandar. Miss Lupescu's hackles were rising. She said nothing, but she was ready for them, and it was only by an effort of will that she did not throw back her head and howl. It's beautiful up this way. Oh, we're at 26 minutes. Let's keep going. It's beautiful up this way, said Scarlet. Yes, said Bod. So, your family were all killed, said Scarlet. Does anyone know who did it? No, not that I know of. My guardian only says that the man who did it is still alive, and that he'll tell me the rest of what he knows one day. One day? When I'm ready. What's he scared of? That you'd strap on your gun and ride out to wreak vengeance on the man who killed your family? Bod looked at her seriously. Oh, obviously, he said. Not a gun, though, but yes, something like that. You're joking. Bod said nothing. His lips were tight pressed together. He shook his head. I'm not joking. It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning. They were just past the entrance to the Egyptian walk, out of the direct sunlight, under the pines and the sprawling monkey puzzle tree. Your guardian, is he a dead person too? Bod said, I don't talk about him. Scarlet looked hurt. Not even to me. Not even to you. Well, she said, be like that then. Bod said, look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean... Just as Scarlet said, I promised Mr. Frost I wouldn't be too long. I'd better be getting back. Right, said Bod, worried he had offended her, unsure of what he should say to make anything better. He watched Scarlet head off on the winding path back to the chapel. A familiar female voice said with derision, Look at her, Miss High and Mighty. But there was no one to be seen. Bod, feeling awkward, walked back to the Egyptian walk. Miss Lilibet and Miss Violet had let him store a cardboard box filled with old paperback books in their vault, and he wanted to find something to read. Scarlet helped Mr. Frost with his grave rubbings until midday, when they stopped for lunch. He offered to buy her fish and chips as a thank you, and they walked down to the fish and chip shop at the bottom of the road, and as they walked back up the hill, they ate their steaming fish and chips drenched in vinegar and glittering with salt out of paper bags. Scarlet said, If you wanted to find out about a murder, where would you look? I already tried the internet.
Depends. What kind of murder are we talking about?
Something local, I think. About 13 or 14 years ago. A family was killed around here.
Crikey, said Mr. Frost. This really happened?
Oh, yes. Are you all right?
Not really. Bit of a wimp, really. Things like that, I mean, local true crime. You don't like to think about it. Things like that happening here. Not something I expect a girl of your age to be interested in.
It's not actually for me, admitted Scarlet. It's for a friend. And that, my friends, is where I'm going to call it. I'm going to get a pencil, a handy dandy pencil. I'm going to put a little tick mark right here where we're stopping for the evening. And that is the end. And I hope to my friend, my follower on YouTube, Zombie Mutt, I believe. I hope that I didn't murder this Scottish accent too bad, and that you can be a little bit pleased. Otherwise, yes, have a beautiful evening. Like I said, if you aren't following me on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, like the videos. It doesn't matter, but it kind of does, I don't know. And I love you. So, love you. Little peace, little love. Stay spooky. Mwah.
Get out of here, you bloody weirdos. Weirdos.